Hello and welcome to another 3pm podcast. No Dan Silver this week, but I am Steve Anglesey and I'm joined by a very special guest from the Daily Mirror. But first, here is Sir Alex Ferguson.
Oh, well, of course, every day is a different life.
So we're joined now by Tony Parsons, writer, critic, former hip young gunslinger, obviously, and author most recently of Tony Parsons on Life, Death and Breakfast. Tony, I mean, ostensibly football has never been more popular, never been more successful, but there's a chapter in your book about where football went wrong for you.
Yeah, no, I mean, football was always there for me. I was taken to football pretty much every other week from the age of 5, and for over 50 years, you know, I was just didn't think about doing anything other than loving football. But I think I've been slowly going off it over the years. And there came a point a couple of seasons ago where there was one incident, and I realised this sport is not for me anymore. I've really just had enough of it. It's not for me anymore. And there's a line in a book by Ernest Hemingway called "The Sun Also Rises," where somebody says to one of the characters, "How did you go bankrupt?" And he says, "I went bankrupt 2 ways. First slowly and then quickly." And I feel like that's how I went off football. I went off it slowly and then I went off it quickly. And the quickly moment I can identify very, very clearly. I was watching Arsenal play at Birmingham, and I was watching it in the company of my then 5-year-old daughter, who was and still is a junior gunner. And she had her full Arsenal kit on. She was a big football fan when she was 5. I don't know if she's gone off it. But and then this is the famous game when Eduardo nearly had his foot ripped off, of course, which everybody remembers. It was a terrible incident and one of those moments when you realise that, you know, the hyperbole of sport is often overplayed. You know, the talk of tragedy. This was a real tragedy. You know, that this young man might never play football again, might never even walk again, and. It was a meaningless game next to the injury to this young player. It was a pretty meaningless, insignificant game. But Arsenal were leading 2-1, and then Birmingham got their penalty at the death, and William Gallas just flipped out. I mean, I was watching with a 5-year-old girl, and she'd never seen a girly hissy fit like it. You know, none of her mates were capable of a hissy fit like the one that Gallas threw, where he kicked holdings and burst into tears and sat on the pitch and was inconsolable and sulky. And I thought, this is really not for me. I thought this sport and me are through, if this is what it's come to. And I also thought, I don't want my daughter to think that this is what a man looks like. I don't want my daughter to think that this is what a footballer looks like. This is what a sportsman looks like. And it was a real big moment for me, because for most of my life, I mean, I'm old enough. How old am I? I'm 57 in November, and so I'm old enough to have watched England win the World Cup. You know, I remember I was 12 years old when England won the World Cup. So I'm absolutely the centre of that post-war football fanatic generation that I actually watched that game and watched those players and watched them year after year and just loved it. And I always thought that I would love England to win the World Cup one more time in my lifetime. It was really one of my main ambitions in life, you know, apart from seeing your family happy and healthy and, you know, winning Academy Awards for adapted screenplays. It was really a deeply held wish and longing of mine that England would win the World Cup. And for a couple of World Cups, I thought, I don't really feel like that anymore. And I actually, you know, Bobby Moore was huge hero of mine, as he was to pretty much every boy and man of my generation. And the thought of the lot that they've got now, basking in that kind of glory and that kind of limelight, actually turned my stomach, you know. And I felt, and I think you never escape it, you know. I'm never gonna be. It's like being really in love with a woman. I think you never completely get over to the other side. And there's always some residual. If it's only a memory of love, then that always remains. And I think I never get football out of my system. But definitely, you know, when we were in South Africa, I thought, do I really? John Terry, Frank Lampard. Do I really want Ashley Cole? Do I really want to see them skipping around the pitch holding up the World Cup the way Nobby Stiles and Bobby Moore and Jeff Hurst and Martin Peters did? And the answer is absolutely not. And so, it's a shame because it was always there, football, and even through the real dog days of the 80s when you couldn't even really, in polite society, people thought you were crazy if you went to football. And that, in those years, after the terrible tragedies of Hazel, Hillsborough, Bradford, when you could decide to go at 5-3 on a Saturday afternoon. Certainly, that was the case at Highbury, I stuck with it all that. I stuck with it all through all those years. But then somewhere, some anonymous player pretended to be hurt. He feigned injury. The unknown footballer fell over when he didn't really need to fall over, and that's when I stopped loving it.
It sounds like your main objection then is to the sort of overpaid and egocentric players. I remember in another book of yours many years ago that I think you were sort of one of the first people to articulate the kind of the unease that people who had been going to football when it wasn't fashionable felt about the middle class fan and the way that the game was changing. Is that a factor in you falling out of love with football as well?
It is a factor. I can remember when football fans were treated like cattle, and that led directly to the tragedy of Hillsborough, and it led directly to those innocent people dying. And so I could never be I can never be too nostalgic for the days when we were treated like cattle. But at the same time, there was something better about the days when you weren't stuck in your own little individual seat as though you were, watching a Puccini opera, or as though you were watching a Harold Pinter play. And I saw terrible violence, unbelievable violence all through the 60s and 70s at football grounds on a weekly basis, riots on a weekly basis. I saw someone pull a shotgun once on the Seven Sisters Road. Absolutely terrifying stuff. It was with my uncles when Man United won a league at Upton Park 6-1. They won 6-1, and it was a bit like being in the cheap seats at Agincourt. It was absolutely terrifying. But I actually prefer something about those days to having some idiot sitting behind me yelling profanities for 2 hours and I can't get away from him. I think I'd rather have 10,000 of the intercity firm in my ear than there was just something. There's when they brought all those necessary changes in, it just became a bit more claustrophobic to me. That you were trapped. I used to be, for years I was season ticket holder at Highbury, and my wife said to me one year, maybe you'll make nice friends with the people you sit next to. I said, it's not really like that, It's not really like you would actually prefer never to see these people again, So I felt trapped. I did feel trapped, and I got a lot of the changes that were made were good. You didn't really. My early memories of football grounds, in I guess the late 50s, Upton Park in the late 50s. White Hart Lane in the late 50s and early 60s. I don't remember seeing any women or girls at all, none. And I think it's good that there's, you get single mums going with their kids, and it's a lot of the changes are good and healthy. But I don't remember that. When I was growing up, I don't remember some idiot sitting directly behind me, some idiot who had 2 brain cells, and yet, because he's got a replica shirt on, he thinks he's Oscar Wilde, he just thinks he's George Bernard Shaw, and I think the wit of football fans has often been overrated, and I remember just more of a crowd atmosphere, more of a genuine crowd atmosphere when I was a kid, not even when I was growing up, when I was a man, it's a fairly recent thing, it's a thing, as I say, that's been growing slowly for me, this going off it, and it is largely a part of what footballers have become. I just remember them as being closer to the fans. I just remember them being closer to their communities. You hear mates of mine, who are Leeds United fans, tell stories about Eddie Gray, getting stick when he was getting the bus home after, not doing very well for Don Revie. And I haven't really got any stories like that. But Frank Saul, the Spurs player, who scored the winning goal in the first All-London Cup final against Spurs against Chelsea in 1967, he lived in the next street to me. And he was just a guy. He was just a guy the way, and he was just a working man the way my dad was a greengrocer, or the bloke on the other side was a mechanic. And of course it can't be like that anymore. Of course there's too much money for it to be like that anymore. But something's been lost. And you know, I went to school with a kid that became a professional footballer. There's a guy called Glenn Keeley, who was a big centre half. And Glenn was in my class for 5 years. And he was a lovely guy.
Did he play for Everton or Blackburn?
He played briefly for Everton. He played very briefly for Everton. He was very unfortunate when he went to Everton because he had to mark Kenny Dalglish in all his pomp and all his glory, and that was not too good. But he played for Oldham, Blackburn, and he was a good guy and a decent guy and a good man, you know, and a good man. And I look at them, and they just seem like sports simpletons to me. Not all of them. And there's still great players, and there'll always be great players, you know. And the likes of Fabregas and Torres and Rooney will, you know, they would have shone at any time in history. But just too many of them are just these spoiled, overpaid simpletons.
I mean, you write a lot in the Mirror and elsewhere. You've written a lot about your father. Was he the guy who introduced you to football? You mentioned your uncle there as well.
Yeah. The people that really introduced me, my dad was a greengrocer and he worked Saturdays, and he was a greengrocer in Tottenham. And my mum so he couldn't take me to football he could never take me at the weekend. And because he was working, and my mum had 6 brothers who were all West Ham fans, and they said, we'll take care of him. You know, it's like being adopted by another tribe, you know, the boy that was adopted by wolves. So I saw hundreds of games at Upton Park when I was growing up, all through that great West Ham side of Martin Peters, Jeff Hurst and Bobby Moore that won the World Cup. And my dad would take me to midweek games at Spurs, and so we'd go and watch Spurs under the lights. But my uncles would take me just to every West Ham game, and it was, you know, although there was trouble and there was violence, it was a family thing, you know, because it was when I spent time with my uncles, and it was strange growing up later. And mates of mine from Liverpool and Manchester and Leeds would say, "Oh, that was a horrible ground to go to, Upton Park. It's a really horrible ground because it's so far from where you come into London. It's such a long way to go, and there's so many chances for the Apache to ambush you, you know." And to me, it was like you know, everything is seen from your own perspective, of course. But to me, it was to me it was a real family ground. And they all wanted to claim me for their own, you know. My dad taking me to Spurs, and my 6 uncles taking me to West Ham. But we used to watch. My uncles used to go to away games too, but I was only allowed to go to the away games in London. And they took me to Highbury to watch West Ham play Arsenal Highbury. And Ian Ewer was playing for Arsenal, this big, blonde, mean Scottish centre-half. And my uncles were snarling at him in the street in Avenel Road. My uncles were snarling at Ian Ewer. And Ian Ewer was like, yeah, he was giving them a big grin, and he had a suit and tie on. And I thought, wow, what a guy, you know, what a man. And then when we got in the ground, it was just so beautiful, you know, and those lights that used to run around the corner of, used to run around the stands at Highbury, they always seemed like pink and blue to me. I mean, I'm sure they were just white, but they always seemed pink and blue. And so I found my own team, you know, And it was a way of not choosing between, but you know, West Ham especially, you know, I've just watched them hundreds of times. And I think it's a bit of a myth, you know, the monogamy of football fans. I think we're about as monogamous with our football teams as we are with our women. You know, that we have, you know, platonic relationships, and we have people we prefer, and you know, I always kind of, and you know, just when you've been to grounds a lot, you always have a soft spot for teams, and I think that's maybe a specifically London team. But I was of that generation that loved football, and that, you know, I'd go and watch, you know, go to Stamford Bridge if Liverpool were playing Chelsea, go and watch, you know, like stand on hoardings, and it's just.
Which, as you say, it was accessible in those days. You could ship up there, you could go with your mates who supported other clubs.
Yeah,
you know,
and you could afford it, and you could get in, and
and that's, you know, and that's something that we talked about last week with with Alan Kirbishley, and I think we talked a bit about that with Kevin Cummins when we did the first of these podcasts a couple of weeks ago. That you go to a ground and you do not see 13 and 14-year-old boys sitting on their own, as we did at that time. So when you were old enough to go on your own, you went to Arsenal presumably, and who were your heroes then? Who did, apart from the
Charlie George was my big hero. Charlie George was my big hero, and I can actually remember Charlie George when he had a crop. Everybody thinks of Charlie with this long lank head, but he was a bit of a suede head, and he was. And watching Charlie George, I felt as I did, the first time I saw the Sex Pistols or the Clash. I felt, I'm like that. He's like me. I'm like him. We're from the same culture, and he was recognisably, a London tearaway, and just brilliantly gifted. And Charlie George was my big fan. Peter Storey I liked. I liked the hard men. I liked that genre. Peter Storey especially, but. Norman Hunter, Chopper Harris, Tommy Smith, you don't really get those players anymore, I don't know, they're, players that look like stewards, you don't really get them anymore, you don't see them anymore.
It's funny, Peter Storey is, I don't know whether it's because of what's happened to him subsequently, but when you mention, Tommy Smith, Chopper Harris, Norman Hunter. He was, an archetypal hard man. Yet he's not really mentioned in those. No,
he's not. And although he was really, maybe the hardest of the lot. He would, at Wembley, he would stand by the door and watch the opposing team get off their coach and put the evil eye on them when they were getting off the coach. It was really like, a park game. Pub teams. It was a great time, and there's an element of like an old man whining. It's not as good as it used to be. The beer's not as good as it used to be. The women are not as pretty as they used to be. The football's not as good as it used to be. But it's changed so much that if I watch what I think of like an archetype cup final from that era, I would say it would be the replay Chelsea and Leeds in 1970 when they replayed at Old Trafford, where they were just like kicking lumps out of each other, absolutely kicking lumps out of each other, and it's just so exciting to watch it now. It's just fantastic. It's like Ali and Fraser in Manila. The level of violence is just terrific, and I just think that they've turned into a bunch of pussies. They've turned into a bunch of pussies, and I took my wife to my wife and daughter were. They've kind of drifted away from it now because I'm not watching it and drifted away from it. But my wife wanted to, she used to go to Highbury with me, and she wanted to see the Emirates, and we watched Man United play Arsenal at the Emirates. I think the first time they played each other. And she said, "Wow, he's such a big, strong, strapping lad, that Ronaldo. He's such a big lad, and yet he falls over all the time." And it's true, he's like a real natural athlete, a big, strong, natural athlete. And it's a shame that it's almost like the most talented ones, like Drogba and Ronaldo. They're the ones that are most prone to fall over in a stiff breeze. What I remember about Charlie George, and it wasn't just Charlie George, it was Rodney Marsh and George Best. They were hard. So George Best was very, very hard, and that's been lost somehow. And I think that they were great role models. They were great role models for the manly virtues. I believe in the manly virtues, and they were just terrific role models. And the badness was on such a acceptable level. That George Best slept with 3 Miss Worlds. I think that's a great thing for any growing boy to aspire to. It's not like puking up over some tattooed slapper and when your wife's out of town on Girls Aloud business. It's just an admirable. The badness was admirable.
They were, they were cavalier days certainly, and that is missing now, I think.
Yeah. Well, they were cavaliers with the pain threshold of roundheads.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right. Now, you obviously you mentioned the Sex Pistols and the Clash back there, and there's kind of no getting away from your sort of break in journalism. I guess it was your first job in journalism was on the NME in 77, 76?
76 was it, yeah.
Okay, so how was the balance of football and music then for you? Would you, I remember reading somewhere that you I think you got to watch football the day that the Stones played the free concert in Hyde Park. But later on, I guess the balance must have changed.
Well, they were separate worlds to me, and they were, I love football and I love music, and really that was, they were the twin pillars of my universe. And as you say, when the Stones played in Hyde Park, played a free concert in Hyde Park, and for some reason I was at Southend. I was watching Southend play with a bunch of mates, a bunch of little skinhead mates from school, and we saw these like hippies, these heads, these freaks getting off the train at Southend who had been to Hyde Park, and I was just so interested in what it was like. So I charged up to them, and they like cowered in terror, and just like absolutely cowered in terror. But they couldn't have loved it more than I loved it, But it was just two separate worlds. That's why and the band that I used to follow around before punk were the Faces, and it was so shocking to see Rod Stewart like kick a football on top of the Pops. I mean, it's difficult to imagine now what a cultural impact that had. This geezer in like tight leopard skin trousers kicking a football about, making a point. I'm a football fan, and but to me they were separate worlds, just because there was just very little overlap, and it was considered, it was, I guess, also when I joined the NMA, it was a very middle class world. I'd never been in a middle class world. I didn't go to university, left school at 16. I'd done menial jobs, and then I was around people. There was lots of drug taking and debauchery. It was very middle class. It was a very middle class world. Whereas football was a working class world. My uncles were printers. They were Fleet Street printers. They lived in Dagenham. My dad worked in Tottenham, and they lived and they worked in working class environments. And football was a working class thing.
And it's true. It is true, and it's hard for people to sort of get their head around this, that they were very separate worlds. We talked about this with Kevin Cummings, who was at the NME after you, obviously.
Well, I knew Kevin. I knew him.
Yeah. And and the number of bands that he's worked with down the years, who now have always been lifelong Manchester United fans, but obviously when he knew them, they had no interest in football at all. No. What about the people that you mentioned there, the Sex Pistols and the Clash and people like that? Did anyone follow football?
I don't remember any of them ever mention football to me. I don't remember any of them ever mention football, and it was almost like you had to make a choice. It was, and I didn't make a choice because because I'd grown up with both, and they were both so deeply, installed in me that it was never that. It was never that kind of fashion. It was never a fashion option, just because it had always been there. Both of them had always been there. Music had always been there. My parents, my family were all huge music fans, and and I grew up in a great golden period for music where you couldn't help but loving music and being into music. To be a little kid when the Stones and the Beatles were making an album a year, you did fall in love with music and loved it forever. But I don't remember anybody ever paying any attention to football when I was in the music industry. And the only time there started to be some interest was because you started to get black players coming through, and they were obviously terribly abused, horribly racist comments about Cyril Regis and that lot, and that generation, Viv Anderson, that generation of black footballers, and they were interested then, but they were interested for political reasons rather than sport reasons, because of what it represented socially and the social change that it represented.
Tell me about you trying to bunk into the FA Cup final at Wembley, which is a great story.
Well, I loved. What people that are young now and are into football now will find difficult to grasp is that there was very little live club football on TV. And one of the reasons why the FA Cup is such a romantic proposition to my generation is because it was really the only live club game that you ever saw on TV. The season built to this, and you'd have Meet the Wives at 10:30 in the morning, and how they got there and all that. And there was a rumour in our playground that you could bunk into Wembley. You could get into Wembley and you could watch the cup final for free if you went up to Wembley the night before and watched the dog racing, because there was dog racing. There used to be a greyhound track around the old Wembley, and if you watched the dog racing and then you hid in the toilet, you could see the game the next day. And so I said to Johnny Ball, "Do you fancy this, Johnny?" And he said, Jimmy Ball. Johnny Ball's a TV presenter. Jimmy Ball was my mate, and we were 15. And you know, I can't remember what the final was. It wasn't like we didn't have any stake in it. We just wanted to see the final. We just wanted to bunk in, and we just heard this rumour. And so, you know, the classic thing. You know, I'm staying with Jimmy, Mum, and Jimmy's told his mum he was staying with me. Just so easy. And we went up to watch the dog racing on the Friday night. And then we just slid into the toilets, you know, just like giggling in the toilets for like hours and hours and hours. And then all we had to do the next day, if we got through the night, all we had to do was get by, like rush the ticket back, because you know there were like cattle pens. There weren't seats. We weren't in individual seats, so we could have snuck in anywhere. So we went up and we saw the dog racing and we hid in the toilets. But at midnight they let the Alsatians out. They let the dogs out at midnight. And there were all these kids, like little kids, being thrown out of the stadium. And they were, must have had it every year, because they were completely unsurprised to find me and Jimmy hiding in our respective cubicles. And the dogs just sniffed us out immediately. And we were just like slung out on the street with a lot of kids from Manchester, who were Man City fans, who had heard the same thing in their playground. And
so it was Man City Leicester, was it?
It must have been Man City Leicester, yeah. Man City Leicester, yeah. And I always forget that it was Leicester, because I was just surrounded by kids from Manchester, and we had a terrifying night in the street, because you sort of went out and there were all these paedophiles waiting on the perimeters of Wembley Stadium, because we had nowhere to go. It was only midnight. It was a long night. We weren't going home. We lied to our parents. And, and we were with this kid from Manchester, and he went off with one of these guys, and the guys saying, "Yeah, come stay at my place, and me and Jimmy were, "Oh no, we're gonna, we like broke into a school, we got grabbed by the police," and it was terrifying. And this one kid from Manchester that we were with, he's probably about 14 or 15. He went off with this guy, and don't know what happened. And then the guy came back looking for us at dawn. No, it was terrifying. It was a terrifying experience. But it was like, it was like being Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer or something like that. It was a real childhood adventure. And but you could do that, and it did. It encouraged anarchy, and it encouraged rebellion, because there wasn't that. If you got into the ground, I got mates from Liverpool that bunked into Wembley, like rushing, going through the turnstile with somebody, someone put their ticket in, and they just like jumped in and then catch me if you can, and it encouraged that, because there wasn't that you've got to sit in row W, seat 26,
Yeah. I mean, in those days, there was no, apart from in the broadsheets, I guess, there was no real serious writing about football. No. And then I think that probably changed, with I guess with All Played Out, which was the Pete Davis book about the 1990 World Cup final, and then shortly after that, Fever Pitch came out.
Yeah.
Were those books an influence on you? What football writers do you like now? What pundits do you like?
I did. I thought that both those books made you aware of how little great writing there was about football, because there's a lot of great writing about boxing, for example. Norman Mailer, Schulberg, and Hugh McIlvenny, right all the way through, from like journalists all the way through to novelists and screenwriters and everything in between. And it's a tradition, it still exists today. Thomas Hauser is a great writer. And when All Played Out came out, and which was really the first, I mean, there were good books before then. Hunter Davis wrote a good book about Spurs,
book,
The Glory Game. That was a good book. Eamon Dunphy wrote a couple of good books about football. But Fever Pitch kind of articulated how marginalised football had become. That there was this intelligent man who, there was so much about it that he despised, that he had a profound and deep love for football. Nick Hornby had a profound love for football, and yet there was so much stuff that he hated about it. The unthinking racism and the violence, and yet at the bottom of it was this love that he couldn't escape from. So that was really, and that I mean, in a publishing terms, that made football books a hot proposition. But there was good writing about football, but it was, you know, there'd be the glory game, and then there'd be nothing till Eamon Dunphy wrote about being a lower division player, you know, and it was they were kind of little oasis in the middle of nothing really, you know.
And finally, I guess, I mean, once again, Arsenal not won anything for following. It's now 5 years, isn't it? So they've gone 4 seasons without winning anything. Are you amazed by that? Are you amazed that Arsene Wenger is so venerated? Are you going to be interested in watching Arsenal this season? Have you watched a couple of the games already?
No, I haven't watched any games at all. I've had sometimes I try, you know, I had like the Liverpool game on, and you know, I mean, I remember 1989. I can remember, you know, going around to Highbury after, you know, Arsenal won 2-0 up there, and Michael Thomas scoring that goal right at the dead. I remember going up and swinging from the scaffolding that was on Highbury, because we must have had the builders in at that time. And I just don't feel like that anymore. I think Arsene Wenger is a decent man, and he's been a great manager for Arsenal, although they haven't won anything for ages. I think what he did was he moved them from Highbury to the Emirates without bankruptcy. You know, that's why he started, you know, buying cheap and buying foreign, and you know, getting you know, French players on eBay and things. You know, they kind of, instead of buying big name guys, that's where, to make that possible, to make it a more profitable club. I mean, my big wish really is that they let Fabregas go with a good heart, because I think he's more than paid his debt to Arsenal. I think Fabregas has been a fantastic player for Arsenal. I think he's up there, you know, with Liam Brady and Tony Adams and Charlie George. I think he's just been a fantastic player, fantastic servant of Arsenal, and I think he should be allowed to go to Barcelona with a good heart and people wishing him well and saying we'll get along with it. And I feel that we're not doing that. I feel that you know, he's like a man that's walking out of the door and his wife's holding on to his legs, screaming, don't go, I'll kill myself if you go. And I feel that Arsenal are like that with Cesc Fabregas now. And I wish, you know, he's been there since he was 16. He's just one of the great players there. And he's the only, you know, he's the only spot of greatness really there now. And I just wish they'd let him go with a good heart, you know, because he's just done so much for him.
Thanks very much, Tony. Tony Parsons on Life, Death and Breakfast is available from all good bookshops.
Even bad bookshops.
Even bad bookshops, September the 16th.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
That's it for another 3pm podcast from mirrorfootball.co.uk. I have been Steve Anglesey and will continue to be so. And don't forget, you can download the podcast on iTunes through the site or listen to it via YouTube. We'll sign off in the usual fashion with Sir Alex Ferguson.
Oh, well, of course, yeah, but it is a different life. Oh, well, of course, yeah, but it is a different life. Yeah, but it is a different life. It's a different life. It's a different life. It's a different life. Is a different life. Is a different life. Is a different life. Oh, well, of course, yeah, but it is a different life.